Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Phipps Conservatory's final session of the One Health, One Planet Symposium, One Health in the Air We Breathe. I'm Dr. Sarah States, Phipps Director of Research and Science Education. Today's session will focus on fracking, the cracker plant, and policy. As a final reminder, the One Health Initiative is a global strategy for expanding interdisciplinary collaboration and communication in all aspects of healthcare for animals, humans, and the environment. At Phipps, we value the connections between the environment and its impacts on human and animal health, and use this as the basis for creating our One Health, One Planet Symposium. Each year, we bring together professionals from diverse disciplines to discuss cross-cutting health topics and how we can take action as a community to build a healthier future. We'd like to thank our sponsors for their generous support of the symposium, Evolve EA, UPMC Health Plan, and an anonymous family foundation. Thanks also to our partner, Sustainable Pittsburgh. And just a final mention, we are offering 7.5 AMA PRA Category 1 credits for physicians and 7 credits for veterinarians. If you're seeking continuing education credits, we need your name and email for follow-up and for sending your certificates. So please send an email to Emily Cherisi in the chat, or email her and she'll put her email in the chat right now. Each day this week, we have been having a 5-minute lightning talk at the end of each session to highlight a local organization that's doing important work on air quality. So today we will feature Dr. Yen-Chia Hsu from the Create Lab at Carnegie Mellon University. Please submit your questions to our moderator in the chat or in the question and answer box. And we're really looking forward to continuing the discussions on air quality and health. Finally, the session is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you very soon. We have subtitles available, so just click on that closed caption box to activate the subtitles. Today's moderator is Dr. Patricia DeMarco, a scientist, passionate environmental advocate, and author of Pathways to Our Sustainable Future, a Global Perspective from Pittsburgh. We were also slated to have Jeremiah Morris join us as a youth moderator today, but a family matter arose, so unfortunately he cannot join us. But Patty, we're glad to have you, and I'll turn it over to you to give a brief overview of the topic and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you all of you for coming. I know this has been a busy week and a really intense time for all of us, and we have a really important topic to discuss today, which is in the context of this whole week, we've been talking about our air, the air quality that Pittsburgh has struggled with for years, and some of the challenges that are facing us include the advance of the fracking industry and the build out of a petrochemical hub contemplated for the Ohio River Valley, one of which is under construction right north of us in Monaca in the Shell petrochemical complex that's being built there. I like to put in context, we're talking about fracking, the cracker plant, and policy. And when we're talking about fracking at all, I like to begin with the fact that this whole industry, it was enabled by what is called the Halliburton loophole in the National Energy Act of 2005. That was a provision that exempted slickwater hydraulic fracturing from 7 provisions of federal health, safety, and environmental standards. Without those exemptions, this entire industry would be illegal. So it operates under the premise of an exemption from safe drinking water standards, clean air standards, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act standards, and certain provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So it has been pressed upon us as a potential for jobs that has once again put forward an industry where our health and our environment are leveraged and compromised on the promise of jobs. And our legislature has put additional incentives to attract and retain this industry for another 30 years as a petrochemical hub. So looking at the health effects, at the effects on our environment and on our air and water is a really critical thing to do, because we're facing quite a long period of time unless we can change some of the policies. The issues that have begun to arise around fracking as it is advanced around our state include environmental justice issues, racial justice issues, especially in areas like the Edgar Thompson Works, which is contemplating an additional fracking operation right there. Fortunately, it was overturned and denied an operating permit by a vote of 3-2 in East Pittsburgh last evening. And so that will be running through another round of objections, and hopefully we can stave that off. But the policy options available at the local level are really limited. We can adopt zoning ordinances. We can certainly increase the awareness of the health effects and try to argue strenuously that people be protected. We can certainly advance the argument that we have better choices and that we would rather not lose the opportunity to do public investment in things that create good jobs without the health harms. I have to argue again that the laws of nature are not negotiable. We have to act on climate change in this decade most vigorously. We have to begin protecting and regenerating our life support system, the fresh air, the clean water, the fertile ground, the biodiversity of species that we all depend on. And we need to transform our economy away from industries that are destructive and extractive without replacing the vital resources we need to live. So with that in mind, I am going to stop talking now. And it is my great pleasure to bring you Dr. John Stolz, who will be our first presenter. He is the director of the Center for Environmental Research and Education and of environmental microbiology professor at Duquesne University. He's been doing research for many, many years on the water impacts of fracking. And Dr. Stolz, I give you the floor.
All right, thank you very much. Let me see if I can get share my screen here. Share, and let's get the presentation going. Okay, so my job is just to give a brief overview. Thank you very much, Patty, for setting up the panel for today, and I thank the F.A.A.P as well for inviting me. But I'm going to give a brief overview of fracking, nothing too in detail, but just to kind of point out some of the things, as Patty mentioned, the focus has been on air, but you know, my main focus has been on water as related to air. So this is my first introduction to Marcellus Shale back in 2010, January. And as those of us who live in the area know, that it has been transformative in many, many ways. But I want to focus on some of the issues, especially the environmental exposures. This is courtesy of Bob Donnan, who's been an amazing advocate over the years. He goes up every few months in an airplane and takes photographs. This one is of the John Day pad. In the act of being fracked, you can see it's a very intensive industrial process, and it's been transforming our rural Pennsylvania, as well as areas of West Virginia and Ohio. A lot of these, there's a lot of trucks involved. There's a lot of chemicals involved. There's also sand, known as propant. But this is just an example of one particular well that's being fracked. The amazing thing is, initially there would be maybe 1 to 4 wells per pad. I've seen now permits for pads that may have up to 42 wells. And each one of those wells is fracked or hydraulically fractured, slick water stimulated by upwards of 10 million gallons of water, as well as 10 million pounds of propant, which is the sand. And we're talking, you know, 42 wells. That's a lot of fluids. That's a lot of materials. You'll also notice here, if you can see my pointer here, this is the dust that's generated from the propant itself. There's small particles of sand that help prop up the cracks that are created in the process. But again, this is sand, and this sand comes from places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. So even though there's no fracking going on there, they are actually being affected by the mining of this fine-grained frac sand. You know, there's been a lot of focus on what's actually being injected. You know, most of it is water, but the chemicals that are used, there's a variety of different ones used at different stages. Each one of these wells will be fracked over a series of stages. I've seen up to several hundred stages. And at each point, they are various chemicals and different size propants are shot down. In the old days, as they said, wells would be fracked with diesel, but that was one of the provisions that allowed for the Halliburton loophole that they're not supposed to use diesel. So today there's a combination of surfactants, biocides, gelling agents, and organics. And this is all, quote unquote, fully disclosed on the Frac Focus Chemical Disclosure Registry. Well, currently there are over 175,000 chemicals currently listed. So when you ask, well, what goes in, what goes down the hole, what's in the fracking mixture, it's very hard to tell because of the different things that the different companies use. And as I said, there's 175,000 chemicals, more than that, currently listed in the registry. So that's what goes down the hole. Eventually stuff comes up the hole, and that's known as produced water. Initially, it's called flowback, and that material has a lot of the characteristics of what went down the hole. But after that, those fluids interact with the rock itself, it begins to take on some of the characteristic and leaches out some of the materials from the rock, including things like the salts, chloride and bromide, metals, things like strontium and barium, as well as iron and manganese. In some cases, there may be arsenic. And then there's the natural occurring radioactive materials. So this all comes back up the hole and is stored in these tanks. They're called condensate tanks. And interestingly enough, they actually are designed that as the pressure builds up and these things collect the fluids, they outgas. And so that's one particular feature of these things. The other thing is most of them are placarded for hazardous waste. So you've got produced water, crude oil, telling you that it's toxic and it's flammable. And yet miraculously, when it goes through this hose, it turns into residual waste. And in the state of Pennsylvania, that allows it to be disposed of in a variety of different methods. Okay, so over the years, I've been able to do a variety of different studies. One in particular, we were able to do some air sampling around these condensate tanks. Now you can see from this picture over here, here's the canister, it's called the Sumer canister, and that's the condensate tank there. Interestingly enough, we were allowed to do this because the company that owned the wells was actually doing some maintenance, so they actually had the wells shut in. Nevertheless, the tanks were still collecting the produced water and they were outgassing. So we did some what's called TO15 analysis with over 73 components of organics and other things, volatiles or VOCs as they're called. So of course the results are not quantitative, but what we did find from looking at these 4 different sets of condensate tanks, measurable concentrations of dichlorofluoromethane, chloromethane, N-butane, N-hexane, N-heptane, toluene, and xylenes. The latter are known to be carcinogenic and pretty toxic. The air surrounding one bank had measurable amounts of acetone, as well as benzene, chlorofluorine, cyclohexane, and methylethyl ketone. It also had the highest concentration of N-butane. Another canister set had benzene, chloroform, chlorohexene, as well as methylethyl ketone. So you can see that there's this rich, especially in Washington County and wells west of 79, as we say, Route 79 here in Pittsburgh, that these are wet wells. They have high concentrations of organics in addition to the methane that they're getting. So that's where the idea of the ethane and the propane and butane, they're all coming up out of the hole as well. More importantly, as I said, these tanks continually produce this stuff. And interestingly enough, dichlorofluoromethane and trichlorofluoromethane are actually CFCs that have been banned by the Montreal Protocol. So how they're being generated, I have no clue. We're looking into that as well. But more to the point, there's all these organics that are typically associated with these condensate tanks, which are a typical feature of a producing gas well in the Marcellus and Utica. Breaking news this past January, Justin Noble wrote an article, published an article in Rolling Stone. I happened to be in it. And some of my data is actually in it, where he disclosed that, this trillion gallons of toxic waste that are produced every year in produced water through the fracking is radioactive. So we know that the rocks themselves have what they call norm or naturally occurring radioactive materials. But once it goes through the processes and there's ways in which you can concentrate it, it turns out that these produced waters can have high amounts of both radium-226 and radium-228. Little point here, radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years, and radium-228 has a half-life of 5.75 years. Radium-226 decays to radon-222, which is also radioactive. And subsequently going down the line, as these products decay, it also produces radioactive polonium-210 and lead-210, which are all radioactive. So the amazing thing is that if you seal up a fresh container of this produced water and let it sit for 2 weeks, it actually becomes 5 times as hot radioactively. So the grow-in or ingrowth of the daughter products, as we like to say, makes the stuff even more radioactive. And as I said before, because it's now this produced water is technically called residual waste or brine, it's showing up in places that you wouldn't believe, including your local, potentially your local sanitary landfill. And this is some data that I generated back in the spring of last year with my colleague Dan Bain at the University of Pittsburgh. But basically, this Rostraver landfill, a sanitary landfill, public landfill, took in so much of the waste over the last decade that now the leachate, or the juicy stuff that is produced at a normal landfill, is so toxic and hazardous that they're having trouble getting rid of it. And this is the actual leachate itself. It's high in organics, it's high in chloride, and it's radioactive. And they had been shipping it down to the Belle Vernon Municipal Waste Treatment Plant as leachate, which is technically okay and technically legal. And yet I went down there and back in the spring of 2019 and found out that not only were they not in compliance for their discharge, but their waste stream was contaminated with chloride, bromide, and it was radioactive. And this was all getting discharged into the Monongahela River. And lo and behold, just downstream was the Charleroi drinking water facility. And if you look at their website and another drinking water facility further downstream, these guys have been out of compliance for all sorts of issues with their drinking water because of this contamination in the rivers. So this is a very nice scene from that was done by the Center for Coalfield Justice, but basically how this radioactive material is now getting into our air, getting into our water, and getting into our landfills. So the radioactive waste, and this is something that's been known for years now. There was a report back in 1990 in the New York Times about how even conventional oil and gas is radioactive. And the reason why it's been allowed to happen, as Patty said, this stuff would be illegal if they had to address the fact that it's toxic and radioactive. So to kind of summarize, the industry itself can be separated into 3 different units: upstream, midstream, and downstream. And this is a table that's going to be in I'm finishing a book that'll be submitted this December on the environmental impacts of fracking. But the upstream includes things like, seismic surveys, geological surveys, leases, landmen, et cetera. But the test drilling is one of those things that can possibly lead to, surface contamination and exposures. Pad preparation, drilling, you saw what was involved with that. The fracking itself, you can talk about silicosis and the exposure of the workers to the fine-grained sands. And then we look at some of the midstream, the transport, the pipelines, they leak, the bomb trains, as they're called, that are transporting the natural gas and the crude oil. pipelines, gathering lines, feeder lines, transmission lines, compressor stations, pigging operations. I'll give you an example of that shortly. And then, of course, downstream, we have the refineries and, of course, things like the ethane cracker plant. These are all potential sources of exposure as a result of the fact that this oil and gas is toxic. So this, again, thanks to Bob Donnan, these operations are not small. Okay, we were originally told when this stuff was happening that it's about the size of a 2-car garage. These pads now are multi-acres. The impoundments for the fresh water can be several acres and hold millions of gallons of fresh water. And then we have the tanks that are being used to collect the waste, and they're building up. We now have tank farms, but these are processing plants. Here's several of them that are in West Virginia. They are huge industrial complexes that are storing things like propane, butane, and of course the natural gas. And then those liquids are now being loaded onto these rail cars going off to various places. And so this is just several different facilities in West Virginia alone. They're dotted all over Pennsylvania. They're dotted all over eastern Ohio as well. This is the stuff, the infrastructure that is necessary for this industry. Up in the upper right-hand corner there, that's a pigging station. Well, what in the world is that? Well, they have to keep the lines clean, the pipelines clean. So every once in a while, they'll send down this little droid that'll go in and clean out the pipelines. But every time they do that, that releases all sorts of gases and what was ever in the pipeline. And of course, it generates blow off, if you will. And here's an example of one of these compressor stations. And there are areas where each one of these may be permitted individually, but when you do the composite impact, it turns out that there is a significant impact on the air quality in the region. And once again, here's the compressor station, and here's the farmer's home. Here's another farm. It's, you know, they're out right in the middle. And then I'm going to finish here. I know I zipped through this really quickly. But we can, if you have questions at the end, you know, during the panel discussion, we can do that. But, you know, this is the downstream process. This is the shell cracker plant as it looked, as Bob took the picture last week. So it's moving right along. That's the Beaver River there. You know, this is what they're talking about. This is the build out. This is what they want. And they're going to be producing these little plastic nurdles, which again are going to have environmental impacts. But once again, everything is in compliance. They're using the, you know, up-to-date technology, quote unquote. But as I'm sure that Jim will tell you next, they basically have bought the offsets. So this is going to be generating a ton of volatile organic carbon, but everything's going to be in compliance because they bought the offset. Same thing with the discharges into the river. Everything's in compliance because, again, regulatorily, they've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's. So anyway, with that, I'll finish up. And I think I did it pretty much good timing. And we'll move on with the next speaker, or we'll back to Patty.
Thank you, John. That's a masterful accomplishment in a short time. I think that's a really compelling overview of the industry that we're dealing with here. And now we're going to turn to Jim Fabisiak, Dr. James Fabisiak. He's the Associate Professor from the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health and the Director for the Center of Healthy Environments and Communities at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. So Jim, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Patty. Give me a split second
Yeah,
here
take
to try
a
to save
minute.
share my screen.
Yep.
Share. Okay, can everyone see the slides? Patty, can you just give me a quick yes or no?
We're good,
Yes,
Jim.
good. You're all good.
All right, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to do something kind of similar to what my predecessor, John, basically just did. there'll probably be a little bit of overlap when we talk about the sort of introduction to oil and gas development in general. I will try to focus perhaps a little bit more on some of the air quality issues and potential health effects that arise from that. So one of the things I always like to keep a little bit of a mindful perspective on, and that is history. And that is that although we tend to think of the oil and gas petrochemical buildup as being something relatively new, actually oil and gas development is not new to Pennsylvania at all. And in fact, Pennsylvania holds a number of distinctions as being first in a variety of these activities. For example, the first commercial oil well was drilled in Titusville, Pennsylvania, up on Oil Creek back in 1859. And in fact, the first facility in the US that we could consider to be a petroleum refinery was actually in downtown Pittsburgh, where the Cure refinery was actually taking crude oil and refining it to kerosene, which was used as lamp oil. And again, as I mentioned, back in the 1850s, this was actually in downtown Pittsburgh. And the Haymaker well in Murraysville, Pennsylvania, just east of Pittsburgh, was actually one of the first commercial gas wells in the US. And the historical marker there actually touts it as being the first time that gas was transported to a large metropolitan city, which in this case was Pittsburgh, by a corporation organized to produce and transport natural gas. So I said we have a lot of firsts in this. I would also point out that there's some dubious distinctions here. First is that the Drake oil well also had the first oil well fire in the United States. There were a couple of fatalities from that. The Haymaker well also had a fire shortly after it began producing that continued to burn for 18 months. And in fact, the Cure refinery in downtown Pittsburgh eventually was sort of encouraged and forced to relocate outside of the city because the neighborhood residents were actually fearful of explosions and fire from that particular facility. But when it comes to modern times and how oil and gas development sort of impacts Pennsylvania now, I'm sure that we've all heard of fracking or unconventional natural gas drilling in some way, shape, or form. I like to sort of at least bring a smile to people's faces by saying this is the rock you've probably been living under if you haven't heard the term fracking. But sort of as we've seen this grow over the last decade or so, there are now nearly 2 million oil and gas wells in the US that have been fracked. It's essentially developed with these unconventional technologies. And there are approximately 20 million people that live within 1 mile of one of these particular wells. What's interesting is that there's some variation into how these wells are developed in populated areas. So for example, in Pennsylvania, which has about 11,000 wells, or did at the time of this slide, that only represented less than 1% of all of those fracked wells within the United States. But within the state of Pennsylvania, about 2 million people live within 1 kilometer of that well. That represents 10% of all of the people in the US that live near a well. So those wells developed in Pennsylvania have a much higher population density associated with them than maybe some of those other traditional oil and gas fields that we think of in North Dakota, Oklahoma, et cetera, out west. As John well mentioned, there's certainly a large infrastructure associated with this, which includes pipelines, compressor stations, various processing facilities, and then eventually the use of that product, whether it be as residential natural gas for utilities, the generation of electricity, as well as the serving as feedstock for the petrochemical industry. And it's been estimated that based on the sort of petrochemical build out in Shell's facility in Beaver County, that about 1,000 new wells would have to be drilled each year just to supply the natural gas liquids required to support the full activity of the Shell petrochemical plant. So we know that there are many sort of hazards associated with this. The challenge is to sort of figure out how those various hazards might ultimately translate to adverse health effects. And I'll show you some of those challenges in just a minute, but certainly we have various air pollutants, as John talked about, hazardous air pollutants and volatile organic compounds that can off-gas from the product that's produced. Since it's a petroleum fossil fuel-based product, it will have some small amounts of all of those types of volatile organic compounds associated with it that can off-gas from the gas itself or from the fluid that is being collected in either open storage pits, which are probably not as popular as they were a couple of years ago, but clearly holding tanks. We also have potential for water contamination, as John talked about. But also some relatively maybe non-chemical based hazards. People who live nearby these types of facilities encounter incredible amounts of noise and light pollution. That is a stressful stimulation by itself, and we all know that stress is not a very good positive contributor to health and well-being. Increased truck traffic, and then the sort of whole political, social disruption that occurs when a controversial industry like this moves into an area. As I said, it has a large infrastructure, so we not only have to consider the harvesting, extracting wells, whether they be gas wells or oil wells, but the transport of that product, whether it be in trucks or trains, collecting of large amounts of the product gathered from various smaller facilities in the producing fields, processing plants that need to essentially separate out the methane, which is being used as the actual natural gas fueling for electricity or residential use, but also, as we've heard, the natural gas liquids that are eventually going to go and support the service feedstocks to allow the petrochemical industry to actually advance and produce its product. And we're not even beginning to talk about the sort of additional manufacturing type of facilities that may be also then placed nearby in order to sort of use the, have ready access to the raw material that's produced by these sort of petrochemical refineries or ethane crackers, as in this case. So Southwest Pennsylvania is a region in transition. Most of you have obviously probably heard of the Shell petrochemical complex. Actually, that's being built on the site of the largest, or what was formerly the largest zinc smelter in the United States, the Horsehead Zinc Smelter. So it's actually being built on the same site of what was a considerable pollution source to our area at the time. And although the sort of profile of the pollutants change between a facility like the Shell ethane cracker versus the Horsehead Zinc Smelter, there's still quite an opportunity for these to potentially have adverse effects. And so I don't really want to spend a lot of time litanizing the whole sort of adverse health effects that might be associated with being in close proximity to these types of activities, but at least to get you to begin to appreciate the fact that these hazardous events and encounters have implications at basically 3 different scales, and I'll try to give you some example for each of those scales. The first is at the local scale, which essentially means what's happening in my backyard. So if, as this picture shows, my backyard is essentially has one of these oil and gas wells being developed, what's the impact of the potential hazards that are coming from this particular facility on people and families that live that close to it. In addition, we have to think about potential impacts and effects, not only at that sort of small distance, but over larger areas. So what happens to a region meaning several counties, for example. And we'll come back to this figure a little bit later on, but essentially shows the places in the state of Pennsylvania that are classified as non-attainment areas for meeting the ozone standard. So these sort of get considered over much larger spaces than just simple backyard, very close proximity scenarios. And also, I'll just leave you with a word about how these types of effects might impact health and wellness on a global scale. So just an example of a couple of events that have to do with effects at the local level. So this is actually a study that was done by Mackenzie et al. From the University of Colorado, which was actually looking at one of the first sort of risk assessments, which was actually measuring the quantities of various hazardous air pollutants in the atmosphere. Some of them are listed here, such as trimethylbenzene or benzene, which is well known as a carcinogen, and measured those concentrations in the air at various locations, classifying those locations at being less than a half mile from a well and greater than a half mile from a well. And then basically did what we sort of consider to be a very traditional, straightforward risk assessment, which is essentially taking those concentrations, comparing them to a benchmark of safety, whether it be a threshold or a known risk of cancer by a given unit of each of those particular pollutants. And to not get into the technicalities of this number, but basically to realize that a number greater than 1 is bad and a number less than 1 is good or better. And we can see that if we look at non-cancer endpoints, this hazard index for these chemicals at less than a half mile from a well is greater than 1, 5, 4, depending on how you consider exposure over different periods of time. And the rate of, or the risk of cancer was approximately double in less than half miles distances from a well as compared to greater distances. There's also a tremendous amount of diesel exhaust that's generated in these particular activities. These are just some examples of that, whether it be the truck traffic or whether it be the use of diesel engines to run the compressors or to run the drilling rigs. But just to show you the idea of truck traffic involved here, it takes about 4,000 to 6,000 truck trips to each well to essentially complete a unconventional natural gas well. So one of the things we have to sort of consider is how difficult it is to sort of make the assumption between what a given exposure is or the presence of that hazard, which we know is there, as John pointed out, by sort of measuring those chemicals that were being off-gassed from that particular holding tank, and then ultimately then determining how that exposure ultimately translates to a risk of disease. And that's the real challenge here, because we have to consider this in terms of, we're looking at best practices or worst practices within the industry. When John sampled that one well, was that an outlier? Was that a low? Was that a high? We really don't know until we have enough information and sampling a lot more. Are we looking at the general ambient concentrations, or what happens after an accident or an intentional short-term release? How close do people live? Is that really in your backyard? Is it a quarter mile away? Is it a half mile away? Do you live downwind or upwind from that facility? What's the duration of that exposure? Has it gone on for 6 months? Is it liable to go on for a number of years? As John mentioned, we're having more and more of these wells that have multi-well pads that get fracked and completed in sequence. So what maybe a couple of years ago, we considered an exposure to last for a period of 6 months, may actually go on now for a period of years as a subsequent well pad is drilled and completed. over and over again on the same well pad. If that happens to be near your residence, your duration of exposure would obviously be different. We do know that a variety of studies have been completed that have demonstrated epidemiologically that there are increased rates and incidences of a variety of adverse effects which are associated with living in close proximity to these natural gas facilities. Number of studies that have looked at adverse birth outcomes, asthma exacerbations, as well as a variety of other effects. So it has been documented. It should be pointed out that at least many of these are basically, or all of them, essentially been based on proximity to living near those wells. So it's a function of if you live closer and around more of these facilities, your risk is increased. That really doesn't point out what is the particular hazard from that sort of list of hazards that I showed you earlier. Which of those is the prime driver for these adverse health effects? And I also want to leave you with at least the point that all wells are not created equal. And I know this is a rather complicated slide, but you could just basically focus on maybe these top three panels, essentially looking at, based on the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection's emission inventory, which essentially reports for every emission, for every Marcellus-based facility, gas well, so to speak, measures the emission of VOCs, PM2.5 or NO2. I've looked at that data in terms of looking at whether the facility is a single well pad, a multi-well pad, or a compressor station. And then, so what I've shown here for any given year is what the emission value was for a particular facility. And that's each one of these red dots. What's important is that there's a tremendous range. This is 4 orders of magnitude right here. So from 1 ton per year to 0.001 ton per year. So the point is, all wells are not created equal. I would much rather live near a well that's like this than a well that's like this. We can see some generalities. We can see that single well pads tend to be less than what we see in multi-well pads. One exception is what's going on here in Washington County. Why these VOCs are so high, I'm not sure, but that is what the data says. Compressor stations, in general, have higher release of VOCs and NO2 as opposed to some of the other facilities. So there are differences in how these different facilities emit. So let's talk about things at the regional level. And so one of the sort of air pollutants that's important from a regional context is ozone. And the example that we can sort of look at here is what's been going on in Denver over the last couple of years. So we now know that Denver routinely ranks in the top 10 poorest air quality cities. We think of the Rocky Mountains as being relatively pristine. This is actually a picture of the Denver skyline on one of these bad ozone smog days. Kind of reminds me of those pictures of Los Angeles that we used to equate with ozone and smog. Ozone is not produced directly by a source on the ground or by man, but is in a sense formed in the atmosphere by a chemical reaction of NO2 and VOCs. We do have an ambient air quality standard, which is 70 parts per billion. And over the last couple of years, because Denver has routinely ranked so high because of its ozone concentration and failure to meet this standard, EPA recently characterized the Denver area as a serious non-attainment zone. So there's been a couple of studies that have tried to dissect out the impact of the oil and gas industry on the ozone non-attainment in this particular region. So the red is actually the non-attainment zone. Here's the city of Denver. Here's the city of Boulder. This sort of gray amorphous area here is the concentration of a lot of oil and gas activity in the front range of the Rockies, the Wattenberg gas field. So there's been a lot of oil and gas development here. So Denver gets about 40 to 55 parts per billion of its ozone from background sources, which means there's nothing that Denver itself can really do to change that. So that leaves another 15 to 25 that contributes to going from this sort of baseline background to being above the standard. And it's been sort of apportioned out as to what the impact the oil and gas industry has, that about 30 to 40% of this locally sourced ozone is produced by the VOCs and the NO2 that is produced specifically by the oil and gas industry. So that obviously helps drive Denver into non-attainment. If we look at that from the context of what little bit we know about Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, you'd see this graph again. So this is the ozone non-attainment area in Southwest Pennsylvania. It is just beginning to come off its non-attainment status because it's been able to meet the standard for the last couple of years. And this goes back in time because one has to consider sort of the history over the last 3 or 4 years, to how it's been meeting the standard, et cetera. But as the oil and gas industry develops here, we are going to be putting in more of those particular ozone producing pollutants, NO2, VOCs. If one looks at the inventories of different pollutants, PM2.5, NO2, VOCs, emitted in these counties, and this was for one given year in 2014, and break that down into the black bars, which are industrial point sources. So think of that as your sort of standard factory producing these particular pollutants, and how much is coming from the oil and gas industry. In other words, even those small contributions from various wells. And you can see that certainly for certain pollutants, and VOCs might be the one to sort of focus on here, that in some of those rural counties, such as Butler and Washington County, VOCs from the Marcellus gas industry are in excess of those produced by industrial point sources in those counties. And you can see that Marcellus makes a significant contribution in almost all of these particular counties. Not so much Allegheny, because we don't necessarily allow oil and gas within the city of Pittsburgh, for example, and only on the very sort of peripheries of that county. So the point is that oil and gas is making substantial contributions to these pollutants in our area, which puts our status of ozone non-attainment or attainment at risk. We did a sort of back of the envelope calculation when the ethane cracker was sort of first in its planning stages, looking at the air permit which was submitted and using the proposed emissions of, these are shell zone numbers, for NO2 and VOCs, which are those ozone precursors. We wanted to put this in a little bit of perspective and say, well, okay, if we build this one cracker plant, what is that similar to something that people might be able to relate to? And we calculated that the addition of this one ethane cracker would be the equivalent to adding 36,000 cars to Beaver County, each of which are driving 12,000 miles a year, which is pretty standard. And that's about a 25% increase in automobile traffic in that. And we know automobile are also good sources of NO2 and VOCs and contribute, for example, to ozone in Los Angeles. If one looks at what would be the projected change in VOCs emitted from various facilities in Beaver County, this is total VOCs released over time, going back to 1999. We see a fairly steady decrease in the release of VOCs from all of the industrial point sources in Beaver County. If we add the projected release of the cracker once it's completed, which is planned for somewhere probably, actually, This was a while ago, so it's later than this. But that would completely essentially negate any of the improvement in VOCs over this period of time, and essentially create a level of VOCs greater than what we've hadn't seen since 1999. So I would pretend that this actually doesn't speak well for the sort of potential for us to be in non-attainment for ozone soon, especially as the climate continues to warm, because ozone is a summertime pollutant produced in the presence of sunlight and high temperature. So last thing, just to give you a perspective of the global effects, we've heard a lot about natural gas being a substitute for coal, and it's undoubtedly true that burning natural gas produces less CO2 than burning coal. But it's important to realize that methane itself is a potent greenhouse gas. In fact, 80 times more potent than CO2. And if one sort of looks at this in terms of the life cycle of harvesting the natural gas and eventually taking it to produce that electricity, which ultimately generates that CO2, the only climate benefit of using natural gas over coal is only achieved if the loss of methane during the sort of harvesting and transport process is less than 3.2% of all that methane that's harvested. The EPA's estimate in 2009 was that there's about 2.4%, which is actually lost. That's getting pretty close to this 3.2. And in fact, several other studies have been done that have talked about losses of methane to the atmosphere on the order of 25%. So this becomes a very, very critical factor in the equation of how use of fracked gas or methane is actually of benefit or not to climate change. Certainly as we plan on using natural gas as a bridge fuel to more sustainable and renewable sources. Shell estimates that just the Shell cracker plant alone would release about 2.25 million tons of CO2 per year, thus contributing to climate change. To put it in perspective, that's equivalent to about 25% of all of the current CO2 emissions in the city of Pittsburgh. And lastly, although this is not really the subject, but I think it's important to realize that as we learn more and more as toxicologists in public health, that that the use of plastics and dependence on plastics in our lifestyle leads to a tremendous amount of accumulated plastic waste that does not degrade in the environment, at least chemically. When it does degrade, it degrades into very, very small particles that we've now termed as microplastics. We're only beginning to consider and study what the adverse effects of those might be as these microplastics essentially enter the food chain. Well documented that a variety of food sources within the ocean ingest these particles, and we eventually ingest some of those products as well. And a very interesting study that just sort of came out last week, so I didn't even really have a chance to make a slide out of this, but it was, someone did a study that looked at sort of the amount of microplastic particles that would be produced by preparing formula, baby formula in polypropylene bottles. And it looked like babies might be ingesting up to about 16 million microplastic particles per liter of baby formula that's being produced this way. So with that, I will end, and sorry if I went a little bit over.
Well, Jim, that's certainly fascinating information, and I know that we all need to hear this. It's a little distressing indeed, but you've given us a lot to think about here at both the local, the regional, and the national and international level. So while you're getting out of your share screen, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Ned Ketyer, and he is a retired pediatric physician. He is a Pediatric Alliance and a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Council on Environmental Health. He is a board member for the Physicians for Social Responsibility in Pennsylvania and in the Southwestern Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. Dr. Ketyer, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Patty. And I'm honored to be introduced by you, Patty, and honored to be on this panel with these other two esteemed participants. So I'm going to talk about the health impacts of fracking and a little bit about plastics. By now, it should be clear to everyone that the real prize in the Marcellus Shale region in Southwest Pennsylvania isn't the methane that we use to generate electricity or heat our homes and cook our food. We do frack a lot of methane out of the ground here, but the real prize is ethane, a liquid hydrocarbon also present in abundance in the shale that's sent to ethane cracker plants to produce single-use plastic, which, as everybody here knows, is one thing nature doesn't need any more of. This is just a map of a satellite view of where the cracker plant is in the upper left corner along the Ohio River, about 24 miles as the crow flies to the point in downtown Pittsburgh. This is another Bob Donnan photograph of the cracker plant. This was a month or two ago, and it's massive. It's one of the largest petrochemical facilities built anywhere. And what it does is it takes that ethane that's fracked out of the ground and it turns it into these polyethylene pellets or nurdles. And this one cracker plant in Beaver County is going to produce 2 trillion of these little nurdles every year. That's going to require a lot of ethane to be fracked out of the ground, a lot of methane too, to produce the nurdles. These nurdles get put in boxes and they're put on trucks, on trains, on boats, and they're sent to plastics factories all around Pennsylvania, all around the United States, and all around the world. This is really what we're talking about here. John talked about fracking, what goes down the well, what comes back up. Certainly, a gas well is drilled straight down into an ancient shale formation more than a mile under our feet. The well is then turned horizontally, and the drilling continues out laterally for a few miles more. Locked in this shale is methane, ethane, and other hydrocarbons. Once the well is drilled and its pipes cemented in place, the frackers come in and force millions of gallons of fresh water, chemicals, and sand into the well at enormous pressures to fracture the shale and allow those hydrocarbons to be released and collected at the wellhead. And so what comes back up? You have the solid drill cuttings, the rock and the dirt, and the salty corrosive brine returning to the surface. Both are contaminated with fracking chemicals, heavy metals, and other earth elements from the highly radioactive Marcellus Shale. You often see brine trucks on the roads and highways with the words residual waste stenciled on the side. But as John was alluding to, these trucks carry toxic flowback. And they're destined for deep underground injection wells and municipal landfills and commercial landfills. And they should be accurately labeled as toxic waste. From the landfills, the toxic leachate that we now know is also radioactive finds its way into the areas, rivers, and streams where communities source their drinking water. Flowback waste disposal in deep underground injection wells have been shown to contaminate streams and produce earthquakes. In addition, some of the toxic wastewater is packaged and marketed to municipalities and consumers as de-icing agents and pool salts. Non-fuel gases like the volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, the fumes of fossil fuels, these return to the surface and contaminate the air we breathe. VOCs like benzene cause cancer in children and adults. Toluene is another VOC that can cause permanent neurologic problems. One of the worst kept secrets about the Marcellus Shale is the fact that it's highly radioactive, and John was talking about that earlier. Geologists have actually known about it for many decades, but it's not even an afterthought for the industry or for the regulators at the DEP and the Department of Health. Radon gas has been shown to collect in basements and crawl spaces in homes near fracked gas wells, and radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer behind tobacco smoke. Finally, large volumes of methane leak inadvertently and are vented and flared on purpose into the atmosphere during fracking operations. Methane, as you've heard, is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, trapping heat in the atmosphere 86 times more effectively than carbon dioxide over a 20-year time frame. Methane leaks like crazy from fracked gas infrastructure. Any greenhouse gas savings that you might get from burning natural gas instead of coal is instead squandered, as Jim was telling us, by allowing methane to carelessly escape from fracked gas infrastructure. So instead of being a bridge fuel to a cleaner and more sustainable energy future, fracked gas is actually a bridge on the highway leading to climate catastrophe. The story of methane and the story of plastic begins at the wellhead. That's not the only place where harmful pollution is generated, however. Air, water, and soil is contaminated at every point of fracked gas infrastructure, from the teeming diesel truck traffic servicing well pads, and you've heard 4,000 to 6,000 truck trips by these heavy diesel engines spewing diesel fumes per well, to the toxic and radioactive waste, as we've talked about, generated at the wellhead and disposed of in landfills and injection wells where even more pollution occurs. Pipelines scar the landscape, they occasionally leak and spill, and they can corrode and explode. Compressor stations emit copious volumes of air pollutants, fine particulate matter, ozone-forming nitrogen oxides, cancer-causing VOCs, radon gas, and greenhouse gases. Pollution continues at gas processing facilities that separate and refine the hydrocarbons, and then beyond at the local cracker plants and other petrochemical facilities. Finally, while some of what is fracked here stays in Pennsylvania, quite a bit of it is actually exported to other states and to distant countries with an insatiable appetite for single-use plastic. And it's not just what is immediately in proximity to where people live that we worry about. This is in Washington County. There's a well pad with the pink balloons. You can see a couple of them surrounding that star in the middle. The yellow thumbtack is a compressor station, but you just have to look at the entire area. This is Washington County, where I live and work, to see that people are exposed to a lot of this infrastructure, a lot of this pollution. So Pennsylvania is the second largest natural gas producing state in the nation. There are now more than 12,600 active shale gas wells in the state, which you can see as the purple dots in this updated frac tracker map. Most of the activity is in northeastern and southwestern Pennsylvania. And most of this activity has happened, all of it, mostly in the last 10 to 12 years. Allegheny County on the left of the map has very little fracking because the city of Pittsburgh has banned the practice. The green dots show where several hundred compressor stations are that move gas along the pipelines, and the yellow dots indicates where violations have occurred so far, more violations than wells, actually. More than 1.5 million Pennsylvanians live within a mile of a well pad and other shale gas infrastructure. 300,000 children attend child care facilities within a mile. Fracking not only threatens their health, the health of our children and their safety, but it threatens everyone's health and well-being. In the 6th edition of PSR's Fracking Science Compendium, the 7th edition, by the way, is due out next month. This is available online, by the way. More than 1,700 peer-reviewed studies and investigative reports found no evidence, none, that fracking can operate without threatening public health directly or without imperiling climate stability upon which public health depends. So the evidence is in. We've learned a lot since fracking began more than a decade ago. Fracking is a proven and dangerous threat to drinking water. And in Pennsylvania, there are many examples of groundwater supplies being contaminated and ruined during shale gas development. The evidence is in. Air pollution follows fracking because, as we've already seen, it is produced at every point of operations. The evidence is in. Living near fracking sites raises the risks for pregnant women and their babies. It shouldn't surprise anybody that women and children would be at the top of the list of impacted residents. We know that people who live and work and children who learn and play near fracked gas sites are vulnerable to environmental degradation and pollution from fracking. And we know now from abundant research in Pennsylvania and other states, and from the grand jury report, which was released over the summer, that people are being impacted and their health is being damaged. As I just mentioned, multiple studies now show that living near fracking sites can complicate pregnancies, resulting in poor birth outcomes like prematurity, low birth weight, small for gestational age, newborns, and birth defects. And all of these have lifelong consequences. The health risk to infants and children living near shale gas development is especially concerning. Children are not little adults. Their behaviors and their interactions with the environment increase the risk of exposure to toxic chemicals. They spend more time outdoors than adults, playing in the grass and the dirt where pollution settles. Every parent knows that kids shove everything in their mouths, whether it's dirty hands and fingers, rocks, toys, and food. Children's bodies grow and develop rapidly, making their organs and body systems more susceptible to damage from toxic exposures. Exposures to some chemicals discharged during fracking operations act as endocrine disrupting chemicals in the body. And these have been shown to interfere with children's growth and development and are linked to major problems with cognitive and brain development. Children have a long shelf life, which means that they have years and even decades after exposure to develop symptoms of chronic diseases and cancer. And let's all remember too, that poor health in childhood increases the likelihood of poor health in adulthood. Older people and those with limited financial resources are also at risk, as are people of color who often live in environmental justice zones close to polluting industries like the oil and gas and petrochemical industry. Residents who have existing medical conditions like chronic lung disease, heart disease, kidney disease, mental illness, and children with asthma are at higher risk for having exacerbations of those diseases due to their exposure to these toxic air pollutants. Fracking jobs are some of the most dangerous jobs in America. Industry workers who are exposed to physical injury, air pollution, chemicals, and radiation may not have the personal protective equipment or training necessary to protect themselves and their families from harm. And we shouldn't forget our first responders. In the United States, the shale gas industry is not legally required to disclose the identity of the chemicals used in fracking operations. This secrecy puts our first responders at a disadvantage when called on to respond to an emergency, and it puts their health and safety in danger. The evidence is in that fracking brings noise pollution, light pollution, and stress. In fact, stress is a side effect of fracking, and it exacerbates mental health problems in gas patch communities. Crime, drug and alcohol abuse, sex trafficking, sexually transmitted diseases, and traffic fatalities happen at higher rates wherever fracking takes place. The evidence is in living near fracking sites makes people sick. It has been linked to asthma, rashes, headaches, and unfortunately, cancer. People who live near fracked gas operations report many different adverse health symptoms. In 2017, Environmental Health Project published a study looking at the health symptoms of adult residents living within 1 kilometer of a well pad. Sleep disruption is often the result of nonstop truck activity, noise, odors, and light while a well is being drilled and fracked. Headaches and throat irritation are also widely reported. As I mentioned before, stress and anxiety are side effects of living near fracked gas sites. Some of these symptoms look like nuisance complaints. But for people who are exposed to fracking activities and the pollution it causes, day in and day out, month in and month out, and with the development of the supersized well pads that can hold dozens of wells, we're talking exposures that are happening year in and year out. Well, these acute symptoms can pretty quickly turn into chronic medical problems. We already know that children and adults living near fracked gas operations are sickened by the industrial pollution. More than 170 chemicals are used in fracking, and we know that they can harm health. No fewer than 55 of those chemicals are known to raise the risk of cancer in children and adults. Radioactive fracking waste is also another major problem that can also increase cancer risk. From 2008 to 2018, in 4 heavily fracked counties in southwestern Pennsylvania, that's Westmoreland, Washington, Greene, and Fayette counties, David Templeton and Don Hopi at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette uncovered 27 cases of Ewing sarcoma, which is a very rare and frequently fatal bone cancer of childhood. And they found 40 cases of other rare cancers in that 10-year period, for a total of 67 rare cancers in children, teenagers, and young adults. In Washington County, again, I live and I work there, 6 cases of Ewing sarcoma and 30 cases of other rare cancers were counted during that time period. Now, these numbers are far more than would be expected to occur in a similarly populated, mostly rural area over a 10-year period. And new cases keep popping up. Parents and physicians are very concerned that pollution and toxic waste from fracking operations may be to blame for this outbreak of rare childhood cancers. Last November, I had the chance to be at the State House with dozens of concerned community members, most from Southwest Pennsylvania. We spoke with Governor Wolf and other lawmakers and demanded a thorough and transparent investigation into the cause of these rare pediatric cancers. And lo and behold, 4 days later, the governor announced the creation of 2 studies to be conducted over a 3-year period by the Pennsylvania Department of Health. But here we are now, 11 months later, in the middle of a global pandemic, and we are still waiting to learn about study designs and timelines from the health department. Meanwhile, in June, a Pennsylvania grand jury released a scathing report about the harms to health, property, and livelihoods of Pennsylvanians living and working near fracked gas operations. In addition to proving criminality within the industry, the grand jury uncovered negligence, incompetence, corruption, and complicity by the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Health, 2 government agencies in charge of regulating an industry that has caused so much damage to public health. Time and again in its report, the grand jury kept returning to the fact that it was children in the gas patch whose health was suffering the most. The grand jury went on to give 8 recommendations for state regulators to try to fix the problems they found and so clearly documented in the report. But reading between the lines of the report, it's clear that the risks from fracking are inevitable because fracking is inherently dirty and dangerous. And industry rules and government regulations will unlikely fix that fact. The evidence is in, and it's indisputable. Fracked gas makes people sick. It degrades the environment and the ecosystems necessary to sustain all life and accelerates global warming and climate change. And as everybody here knows, climate change is a medical emergency. In fact, the health impacts of climate change demand immediate action, says practically every public health and medical organization in the United States and around the world. So I'm going to stop here by saying that as a pediatrician and a father, I know that children live in a world shaped by our choices. Well, we need to start making better choices for the sake of our children's future. And we better start making them fast because, as everybody knows, we've run out of time. Thank you. Patty, back to you.
Thank you, Ned. That was a really compelling story as well. We've had 3 really interesting and important summations of the situation that we're facing here. I first of all want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box or into the QA box so that we can raise them for discussion among our panelists. And I would like to start with a question that kind of is provoked by all three of you, which is really, given that we have such compelling science documenting the fact that fracking is a health harm, an environmental harm, and really a public health affront to everyone living close or far, how can we marshal a level of outrage sufficient to move the political forces in our state, in our local communities, and at the national level? I don't know who'd like to take that first, but I think, you know, what can we do to actually marshal support for action on this?
Well, it's bringing the attention. You know, I know that both Don Hopi and Dave Templeton got a lot of heat for their series, but it really did, you know, put the spotlight on. The same thing with Justin Noble, and it's just they're scratching the surface. You know, there's more. Justin's produced more information. Also, Public Herald is another source of information, of independent journalism. That's been part of the problem, that, you know, even the newspapers are reluctant to publish certain things because they rely on the revenue from the companies to buy the ads. And so that's been an issue, but just getting people to understand. And then, you know, folks like us getting into the weeds, and I mean, talking to the regulators, you know, just as a case in point, that landfill has so much of this leachate, so they thought that they would do something that's usually used at landfills to reduce the volumes. They were going to put an evaporation system in. Well, that's fine and good if it was, you know, it wasn't bad water, but the problem is that they just have to, the permit involves NOx, SOx, and VOCs, but there's no mention whatsoever of radioactivity. And a basic calculation that I sent to the DEP when the comment period was open for that permit, I said they're going to go from hundreds of picocuries per volume to tens of millions of picocuries.
Right.
So they're going to have something that's incredibly radioactive, and they don't have to test for it. Well, thankfully, the guys in the Radiation Bureau of the DEP got wind, and I don't know where it stands right now, but the point is that as long as the certain groups will turn, you know, the DEP, for example, turns a blind eye, then that's going to be a problem. But just getting it out in the public and getting it to the communities, that's going to be very powerful.
Jim, you look like you want to speak to that.
I don't know, the thought that first came into my mind was something about it. I think it's certainly my bias being a scientist, and that is, you know, that we have to make these decisions based on sound science and fact data-based policy. I mean, we see that being sort of deficient in many aspects of what's going on in our society today, from COVID, you know, to this. So I look at that as a sort of systemic flaw that we need to pay more attention to. But part of that also is, how do we deal with, and I don't have an answer to this, but I think it is an important part of the conversation, is how do we deal with the uncertainty that is also inherent in the way we approach science? I mean, people expect that scientists, we know everything there is to know already, and unfortunately we don't. And so then how do we deal with the uncertainty that exists between the what is and the maybe? And how do we incorporate that into making policy that is certainly a balance of a precautionary principle and one that certainly also allows technological advancement? But I think that's, you know, it's hard enough to explain science to people. It's harder to explain the uncertainty of science to people.
Well, and there's degrees of uncertainty, right? I mean, you can have, as a number of you showed, ranges of variability around a norm. The general public doesn't understand probabilities very often. It is just, if it isn't black and white absolute, they expect answers that are absolute, but yet they don't demand similar absolute from industry emissions requirements. So the industry gets away with a lot of wiggle room for things.
I would
and
agree. And, you know,
I-
you've got to have that science-based, fact-based part of the conversation on both sides of the table.
Yeah, so Ned, what do you think about this whole thing in terms of how we deal with it? You talk to patients and to the public all the time.
Right. I think the public doesn't have the knowledge. They don't have the language of science like we do. The bad news is that our policymakers don't speak the language of science either. And in fact, you know, these presentations, as good as they've been all week, I would bet most policymakers their eyes would have glazed over, especially today, because we did present some scientific knowledge here. So it's really the policymakers that really need to get the message, and we have to try to translate the research in ways that they can understand and do something about. But they're going to follow the money as you would expect, and they're always going to try to balance health and economic growth. And very often you can't balance it, and you shouldn't try to balance it. You know, we're here and then we're gone on this planet. And if, as my grandmother used to say, if you don't have your health, you don't have anything. So I think what people can do is it starts in about 11 days, people can vote. I think that's really important. People can get in contact with their policymakers, with their representatives, and tell them, my health matters to me and my children's health matters to me. And that matters more than anything else. And we have lots of plans. We have lots of proposals to move forward in a way that gets us away from fossil fuels, gets us away from this pollution, and expands the economy and increases economic opportunity in a fairer way for everybody, and improves the public's health. So it's really, and improves the climate system. So it's win-win-win if we take the technology that we already have and the knowledge that we already have, and find a different way, a better way to move forward.
Now, I would contend that we don't have a technology problem. We have an ethics problem. I don't see how any politician or any other person in a decision-making position can hear the data that we've heard today, even reduced to normal language. Children get sick if they have playgrounds within a half a mile. And yet the setback standard in the zoning regulations, I believe, is 200 feet. And the Attorney General recommended it expand to 500 feet. It's an outrage that such things would even be contemplated under the face of the data that we've heard today. So how do we translate that level of outrage on an ethical basis, not even a science basis? I mean, we're doing things that we know harm children. This isn't okay, right?
That's right. And I just want to just correct you a bit. The setback distance from a well pad in Pennsylvania is 350 feet.
Oh,
and the grand jury wants it at least 2,000 feet, and even more for sensitive populations. So yeah, it's too close, and the grand jury made it clear that it's too close. So we need, everyone knows that pollution is bad. I mean, everybody knows. Doctors know it, but so their patients know it too. And if it smells bad, they know it can't be very good in my lungs either. And so, people have to start speaking up and, talking about it. Doctors have to talk about pollution, about fracking, about climate change. They have to talk about it with each other and with their patients as well.
Yeah. I'm interested in something that came up in John's talk that really alarmed me a bit, kind of slid past it quickly. You had a graph up that indicated the amount of chloride in the produced water, about 4,487 milligrams per liter, and that was in the leachate from the landfill, which means it was dumped into the landfill. Now, salt is very soluble, Are you concerned about that level of saline contamination getting into the watersheds and into the drinking water supplies?
Absolutely. And just, again, I find and unfortunately that somebody didn't do the math.
Yeah.
And, we had this situation early on. Historically, oil and gas waste were being brought to waste treatment plants for dilution.
Yeah.
And the volumes basically were 1 in 100. And it worked for coal bed, it worked for a variety of other things because they weren't that salty. But the stuff from Marcellus is upwards of 300,000 milligrams per liter of total salts.
Well,
And
give
you
a
can't
comparison.
dilute
How
that.
is
And
it compared to seawater, for example, so people get an idea of what we're talking?
what is it? Yeah, it's 34 grams per liter for
So it's close to
water.
1,000
Yeah.
times more salty than
Oh
seawater.
yeah, absolutely. 1,000 times more salty. So, that was part of the problem. And that's why I was completely flabbergasted to find out that they were doing the same thing with the landfills. And basically all they're doing is they're taking these liquids, throwing kitty litter or some other absorbent, wood chips is a popular one, and then putting it into the landfill. So, again, I had my suspicions, but the fact is that more importantly, there's a lot of bromide. And so again, going back to the original situation, we stopped the industry from taking their waste directly to the waste treatment plants because the bromide levels in the Three Rivers was going through the roof. That led to the drinking water facilities having issues with a cancer-causing chemical or chemicals called trihalomethanes, which again, getting technical, it's part of the chlorination process to making drinking water. But basically, they were producing cancer-causing chemicals when they were trying to treat the water so we could drink it. So it's come back, and that's what was puzzling me because these water facilities were having these troubles. And it turned out that could be traced right back to the waste treatment plants taking leachate now.
Mm-hmm.
So, again, somebody didn't do the math. Somebody didn't realize it was going to have an impact downstream.
Yeah.
So the good news is when I went back to that waste treatment plant a month later and again, the proof was they put in they stopped the flow, they had an injunction, and they were back in compliance.
Yeah.
So, proof positive that this practice,
My concern is that as we get saline contamination, it has high blood pressure effects, it has all kinds of other effects and compounds other difficulties that people are experiencing. So
manganese,
manganese,
which is a common constituent of this stuff, can be as serious a neurotoxin as lead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the new data on that, manganese should be on what we call the primary standard list.
So I'm struck by all of you talking about how the multiple components of the fracking industry each have their own emissions points, and you have a compounding effect on what people experience. And yet we regulate one installation at a time in widely divided geographic areas and jurisdictions. Do you think we could begin to call for a more unified system-based or installation-based regulatory system that looks at all of these things as an integrated whole instead of in isolation one by one? Do you think that would help?
It would definitely help. That was the early call to arms. Basically, was the mayor of Dish, Texas.
Yeah.
Dish, Texas was the site of 5 major pipelines, and each of the compressor stations in the town had been permitted separately, but they were within a very close geographic area within a couple of miles of each other. So the cumulative effect of having these 5 major pipelines intersecting within a couple of miles created a situation that was toxic. The VOC levels in the town skyrocketed, and we're facing the same situation. What's that?
It's basically an abandoned town now.
Yeah, yeah, and these things are happening in Ohio, and to a certain extent down in southwestern Pennsylvania. So it's where these things come into contact, and that map by Frac Tracker, amazing, the number of compressor stations.
Mhm, mhm.
You know,
Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to go back to something that Jim said. You were going through a number of impacts of fracking that are not necessarily chemical based, and one of them you talked about just a little bit is the social disruption that's been associated with many of these operations as they've come to be functioning. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I think that's really important issue that we didn't really explore much.
Right. So I think, there's a lot of facets to that. And some of them indeed got mentioned in various places. So if I kind of used the term social disruption, it was somewhat of a blanket and could certainly take one level. I mean, we certainly know that this is a controversial subject, and somebody can be in favor of this in your community because of the financial benefit that you're reaping because of the well that's placed on your property. And yet your next door neighbor, who is put at just as much risk, does not get any financial benefit from that because they're not leasing their land or whatever. That causes a certain neighbor to neighbor confrontation that looks political, but probably even gets a little bit bigger than simply a political liberal versus conservative thing. And I think the last thing we need in the country right now is any more sense of division, but also the social disruption that comes from the fact that you have, for example, in any kind of boom economy, you have an influx of new workers that are coming from out of state that can afford to pay good rent. And so move into a community and are now competing for rental spaces with elderly or people who are on less well-to-do means that have limited incomes. Well, if I as a landlord can get $1,000 a month for my place from the well worker to $800 from the little old lady who has been living in that community for a long time, I'm going to raise my rent. So that causes difficulties in housing. The sort of perhaps the crime that might be associated with that. We heard about sex trafficking, for example, and that's been well documented to be associated with a number of these boom economies. Increased drug and alcohol abuse. So all of these I would sort of lump under a sort of, a social disruption or malaise, so to speak.
Can I just mention and add to that, that in the work that I do with Environmental Health Project, we give tours along with other groups, Clean Air Council as one, Earthworks is another. We give tours of Washington County of all the fracking sites, compressor stations. We even take a trip up to processing facilities, and we meet impacted residents, people whose health has been impacted, but also their livelihood, their property has been impacted. The fabric, the social fabric in these communities where there's a lot of this activity going on has really been torn. And it's pretty frayed right now. You have one neighbor pitted against another neighbor, one person who wants it, another person who doesn't. You have it within families as well. And it causes a great deal of stress, a great deal of anxiety, and of animosity among people. You drive through these communities in Washington County, and it doesn't look like it probably hasn't changed much in 50 years. The wealth has not trickled down to most of the people who live in the gas patch. And people really need to understand that.
I think that's a really important point, because I think we look at the $6 billion in incentives that were given to the Shell plant. They have now 1,000 fracking sites per year to feed that plant, and there are theoretically 5 proposed for the Ohio River Valley. So you can see the fate that's drawn out for this region by people from outside and people from multinational corporations. If you talk to the people in our area, and I I've been involved with a number of reimagined things. This is the one from Beaver County. There's one in Turtle Creek. There have been ones all over in Erie, Lehigh Valley, all kinds of places where if you ask the citizens, what would you like to see for your future? Not one of them will say, we want more plastic, we want more fracking. They have a lot of good ideas about what they'd rather see instead. So I think what I would like to take away from this session is we have to get a little bit tighter down is what can we do to articulate a better future for this area? How can we use this really compelling information that you've all been sharing this morning and that you do in your ongoing work to help us build an argument for a better way forward and not have to spend so much time battling and trying to, it feels like you're trying to resist the onslaught of a dragon and you've got a tin hat and a little spear. I think we need to get a bigger voice. And I'd really like to, hear how you can help us. What are our tools to make this a much more forceful argument, not just on the science, but on the moral and ethical argument that we have a better way forward for our children. I listened to the Youth Climate Summit this morning, and they had 128 students down as low as 5th grade, our future leaders just standing there waiting for someone to give them space to make a better future possible. And how can we do that?
Well, let me start and just say that to let people know that there are a pretty large number of organizations working in and around Pittsburgh and Southwest Pennsylvania throughout the Ohio River Valley that are very much involved in collecting data, in taking that data and helping people understand what the risks are and reimagining the future. And so I would just say to anybody who's watching is seek out the groups that are doing this. Get on their mailing list, get their newsletters, give a donation if you can, but get involved just by learning at first. And that's what I would say to young people too, is keep learning, keep asking questions, stay positive, but you have to do the work moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay.
I would also say get politically involved. Let your elected officials know how you feel, because they'll just listen. There's 203 oil and gas lobbyists registered in Harrisburg. That's enough for one for every representative. And they're in their
there
ears
every day.
and they're there every day. Okay. And so the thing is, you have to let people know. I'm working with a legislator right now on introducing legislation to close the landfill loophole, because unfortunately, we're turning these landfills, sanitary landfills, into hazardous waste sites. And where the taxpayers are going to be the ones that foot the bill at the end of the day, because they've created such an enormous problem.
Yeah, the profits go to the corporations and the costs go to the taxpayers. That's really true. Yeah. Jim, anything you'd like to add to this?
Oh yeah, I was just going to add, it's probably an extension of what people are saying, but I would also think that it probably is important to realize that everyone has a different set of skills, a specialized skill set. So I think in order to sort of translate a lot of what we've been talking about into action at the community level takes perhaps another set of skills that continues to engage those people on a day-to-day or routine basis to actually lead to some action, right? I mean, we've all done a lot of these where, we are the so-called experts or whatever. I'm not bragging about that, but that's sort of why we're brought in. And we present these sort of one-dimensional formats to an audience, provide information, provide facts, but then that audience needs to work with those facts every day. And in some part, that's sort of this Reimagine program kind of does that, gets those people thinking about that on a routine basis, sharing ideas, So that takes another set of skills and another set of people to kind of translate that and move that along the pipeline, so to speak, no pun intended.
Yeah, I would like to point out there is a Reimagine Appalachia blueprint going on right now that has started to look at what it takes to put people to work who've been in these traditional industries and can transition to things that can be sustained and build those pathways from where we are to where we need to be and make it real to people. People will not move into a vacuum. I've been talking about pathways to a sustainable future for more than 10 years now. But until people can actually see, and that's why FIPS is so important. I mean, they just got a governor's award for excellence in environment. And I think being able to visualize what a living building looks like. We put up a net zero energy borough building, and a lot of people come in there and say, wow, this doesn't look weird. It's not like space age. And it wasn't so expensive that a little town of 6,000 people couldn't do it. This is no longer a pipe dream, but we have to have a different, stronger narrative that this is the way we want to move in the future, and that it's not only possible, it's right. So,
and in some ways, it's an antidote to that social
It is.
disruption that we were talking about, because it gets neighbor speaking to neighbor, even those that might have had some controversy and some, polar opposites may be able to get unified around something that has a sort of given sort of, direction.
Right.
It makes people feel less helpless, powerless. It's like, oh, maybe I can do something about this rather than just
community gardens do that, and community power does that, and community spirit, that we can get through this if we work together. And so I'll close it at that and give this back to Sarah. I certainly thank you so much. I give a round of applause to all of you. I'm glad this is recorded. This is really valuable information, and I appreciate you spending your time to share that with us. Sarah, it's all back to you.
Thank you, Patty, and thank you to our speakers today. That was a fantastic talk, a fantastic series of talks. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. So I'm going to turn it over to our lightning talk speaker now. Today we are featuring Dr. Yen-Chia Hsu, project scientist at Carnegie Mellon's Create Lab, to tell us about the Smell PGH project. So Yen-Chia, thank you for joining us today.
Hi everyone, I'm Yen-Chia, and today I'm going to talk about Smell Pittsburgh. So I have typed a link in the chat, and it's the slides, so you can have access to that. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, is the screen okay for everyone? Can you see that? Okay. Yes,
it looks good.
Okay. So I'm a project scientist in the CMU Create Lab, and Smell Pittsburgh. This is a topic today that I'm going to talk briefly. It's a mobile application for crowdsourcing and visualizing pollution odors. So you can download that from the Google Play Store or the iOS store. It's an application that you can download to your phone. Then you can take it with you and then walk around the city. And then when you smell something, you can report in the rating between like 1 and 5. Then you can submit the source of the odor, symptom of the odor, and also like any note that you want to submit. So this report will go to the health department and also our database. By doing that, by using this system, we can allow citizens to contribute the odor reports in real time with accurate information. And we also visualize all the data together in a map. So on the right side of this picture, you see a map. The triangle icons indicate smell reports. The circle icons indicates the sensor readings, and the blue arrow indicates the wind direction. You can use the interface, and you can animate this by clicking on the triangle, on like the play button. Then it will show you like the animation of what happened in that day. And if you are interested, you can go to smellpgh.org. Okay, so after we deploy that system, what's the impact? It turns out the community members, they print all the smell reports together into a giant scroll, and then they read it at the health board meeting. And this actually urges the regulators, the officials to respond to say that now they are going to enact more strict rules to the coke plant. So in this way, you can see like how people can use the data and how data can be powerful for as data-driven evidence for supporting air quality advocacies. After we collect all the data, I begin to wonder, is this data actually useful in predicting local air quality patterns? So we did a study to build an AI model to map the air quality data to the smell events. So this is actually the push notification that you saw on the system. We have a push notification that we will send to the users and said if today the AI model detects some, it's likely that in the next 8 hours there will be a poor odor event, then we will send a push notification to notify our users. And here is how we do that. So we take all the data from the monitoring stations. These sensor stations, they are operated by the county. They are operated by the Allegheny County Health Department. These sensors, they provide readings like SO2, CO, hydrogen sulfide, etc. We take all these sensor data and we put that into the model, and then we predict if in the next 8 hours, there will be a lot of smell events coming up or not. So by doing this, we can train the AI to recognize and predict smell events. After we build this model, we begin to think, oh, actually, how does the AI model make decisions? Can we actually identify pollution patterns from this model? It turns out about 30% of the smell events can be explained by this pattern. So this is the pattern that I'm going to introduce you. It's a really important finding in our work. This is Pittsburgh, and there's several monitoring stations that I plot on this map. On the bottom part, that's the Liberty Monitoring Station. That's the monitoring station near the Clairton Coke Works and Edgar Thompson. And on the top, there are 2 monitoring stations, the Parkway Monitor and the Lawrenceville Monitoring Stations. So now I'm going to explain a little bit about the model. So this model is like how doctors make decisions. When we look at the first node, this one is actually our original data. We have about 300 data points that has no smell event. We have about 16,000 that has no event, and we have 300 that has an event. And typically the model, the first predictor that the model is looking at is the most important one. So here is the model. Here is the predictor. It's looking at the Lawrenceville monitoring station's wind direction multiplied by the hydrogen sulfide readings. And by using just this single predictor, we can narrow our data points down from, this is our negative no events. Data samples can be narrowed down from like 16,000 to like 400, which is a really significant reduction. And this one tells us that something may be emitted from the source. This is the hydrogen sulfide reading, like previous 1 hour. And then when the wind points to a certain direction, they kind of combine together, and then eventually a lot of smell report will come up. If we look at this model further, we can see it's a combination between the wind direction on the Parkway monitoring station multiplied by the hydrogen sulfide on the south side. So this tells us important information about like 30% of the smell events. Like how does that come up? Okay, and this is the end. If you are interested in more details about the data analysis, I would encourage you to click and go to this one, the Smell Pittsburgh, smellpgh.org/analysis. It has a lot of the details about our user data, about the distribution of smell reports, and also the analysis that I just presented to you. And if you are interested in the research, you're welcome to look at the bottom 2 papers. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hsu. We have time for a couple questions, I think, if anyone wants to drop them into the chat. I'm going to start with one. So I'm wondering if you have seen any evidence of the pandemic on smell pH on users or patterns in the data.
We haven't done like a large analysis on that. But one interesting that I found is that I was thinking about, oh, maybe our user number will drop. Maybe like people will not report any smell because people stay home right now. But actually, I don't think I see that pattern. Like there's still a lot of people reporting, and we noticed that there's a lot of bad days also right now. So yeah, that's just something that I found.
Mm. Thank you. And how many users do you have using the app?
2019, we have probably like I think probably 6,000 users. 2019, yeah, and 2018 and 17 we have less users. We probably have like 1 or 2 couple of thousands. Yeah,
That's great. Oh, well, hopefully you'll have a few more from our symposium.
Yeah.
So I would encourage you all to check out the Smell Pittsburgh app. Maria put that link into the chat for us, so please go check it out. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hsu. It's great to hear about your work. And I think we're going to wrap things up now. So I will turn things over to Richard Piacentini, our president and CEO at F.A.A.P.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank all of you for joining us today and for all this week, actually. We've had such a wonderful collection of talks and fruitful discussion. I'd also like to thank our planning committee for helping to cultivate a group of speakers with such broad expertise. And again, thank you to all of our speakers and moderators for bringing awareness to the environmental and human health issues associated with air quality. We've touched on several complex intersecting issues, from inequities in access to clean air, to complications due to COVID-19, to local and federal policies. Despite the environmental challenges we face, I appreciate that our speakers were able to provide a path forward with ways that we can all take action. We'd again like to thank all our sponsors for their generous support, Evolve EA, UPMC Health Plan, and an anonymous family foundation. And thanks also to our partner, Sustainable Pittsburgh. I'd also like to thank all of those at F.A.A.P. who made this virtual webinar possible. Thanks to our marketing team, and also to Sarah, Maria, and Emily for organizing and coordinating the event. And of course, thank all of you for joining us. Now I'd like to turn it back over to Sarah for a couple of final notes.
Thanks, Richard. Just a couple final notes. We will be sending a survey to attendees in the next week, so please look out for that. And we hope that you'll share your thoughts about this virtual One Health, One Planet Symposium with us. We will also be following up with those of you who have requested continuing education credits. Thank you again for attending our symposium this year. We hope that you found these discussions informative and have found ways to take action in your home and your communities. Stay safe, have a great afternoon, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.